There is this tendency to, to kind of apply our knowledge about al-Qaeda to ISIS, and that helps in some ways, but it doesn't help in other ways, because ISIS is multi-layered. It's more complex than al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a terror organization. ISIS is a terror organization, but also it's an insurgency and it's an army in many ways. No, the fact that ISIS needs land to kind of legitimize its message and its mission is both an asset and a burden for ISIS, because once it's rolled back, it has to prove that it's still expanding. So it's a race against time most of the time. So it's it's different from al-Qaeda in that sense, that it needs territory to establish itself, because it has appealed to a lot of people. Because it has established itself as a fact on the ground, as a group capable of fighting sectarian governments, or people, what people think they are sectarian governments, like in Syria and Iraq. So the territory is essential for ISIS. I think the question of whether ISIS is Islamic or not is oversimplified most of the time. I think it's both. It's in the same way that people think of ISIS as a hybrid military force, that it's an army, it's a terror group, and an insurgency. It's also a hybrid ideology. It has a political project, but also has a religious project. And people who drift and gravitate towards ISIS usually have two backgrounds. They have a religious background, or they are tempted by a religious background, at least probably produced and created in the process of recruitment. But also they have to have a political background. And once these two backgrounds merge together, you have a very good chance of that person becoming an ISIS member. So it's a combination of these things, and religion is very important in the ideology of ISIS. You cannot undermine the importance of religion for ISIS. It justifies all its acts through religious references. It's not a pretending that it's Islamic. It behaves as an Islamic group. Every member of ISIS has to comply with the ideology that ISIS says it has, which is the takfiri kind of ideology that believes in the excommunication of fellow Muslims and considering Muslims or labeling Muslims as infidels. So understanding that religious background is very important to understanding ISIS. And, one of the things that I think Lisa understood about ISIS is that, or one of the mistakes that people make about ISIS is that it's one thing or another. I think it's more than that. It's many things, and it's a complex group. It appeals to people for a variety of reasons. It's a political project, it's a religious project, but also it's a model of governance that suits some people in Syria and Iraq. It's a Ba'athist ideology, but also an Islamic ideology. It's a variety. It's many things, and I think unless people understand the complexity of ISIS and admit that, instead of saying ISIS is not Islamic or ISIS is a terror group, not an insurgency as well, that won't help in the fight against ISIS. Well, we haven't found any evidence that ISIS has hit a wall. I think it's still expanding. It's still appealing. The ideology is expanding. Maybe territorial, it's not expanding anymore. It is actually expanding in some areas, and it's losing in other areas. But ISIS is still holds control and full control over its heartlands, areas like Mosul, Fallujah, Deir ez-Zor, and Raqqa, all these all these strongholds, in different degrees. So I think, and it's still expanding also beyond Syria and Iraq. And I don't see ISIS being defeated. I think the reports that ISIS is declining are exaggerated, and they're part of the propaganda, which is not helpful, because you need to basically be more in touch with the reality, with what's going on, because unless you do that, any strategy would be flawed. Any strategy would be based on wrong premises. It is. It's interesting that like the fight for ISIS is a fight against Sykes-Picot. It's about which one would show or prove they are more resilient, borders or ISIS. If ISIS survives for another 10 years and 20 years, let's say, I think people will start to say maybe borders are not important and we can live with ISIS as it become a reality on the ground. But if borders prove to be resilient, then I think ISIS will then start to fray and start to be seen as an idealistic, maybe over like out of touch with the reality. The end game is that local forces from Syria and Iraq and elsewhere believe in a political process that is credible, viable, and that they can engage with and through in Syria and Iraq. The problem is we haven't seen that yet. I think the situation is getting worse in both countries. In Iraq, we find Iranian-backed militias being on the rise, and they benefit from the presence of ISIS in the same way that ISIS benefits from the rise of these militias. And in Syria, we have also the Syrian regime is still bombing civilians and still seen in Syria as worse than ISIS. So unless that changes in the two countries, I don't see any end game for ISIS. ISIS will still thrive in this kind of environment.